Hollywood loves to think it owns the World War II movie genre. But here's the twist. Across the Atlantic, Britain was crafting films just as bold, moving, and inventive, only most Americans never heard of them. Why? Maybe they lacked the splashy star power, maybe they were too rooted in everyday grit, or maybe they just didn't make it across the ocean. But what if I told you these hidden gems reveal a side of the war Hollywood rarely dared to show? Let's dive into 15 great British World War II films Americans usually ignore. The Next of Kin, 1,942 loose talk costs lives. That wasn't just a wartime slogan, it was the pulse of the next of kin. Released in 1942, this British film wasn't about daring raids or battlefield glory. Instead, it focused on the danger of gossip. The story follows how a few careless words in Britain could spiral into devastating consequences abroad, exposing troops to enemy traps. What makes it so gripping isn't flashy special effects, but the chilling realism. Director Thorold Dickinson, working with the War Office, built the plot around real fears, spies blending into the crowd, secrets slipping through everyday chatter. Unlike the polished American war pictures that celebrated courage, this film leaned into paranoia and responsibility. Everyone, yes, even the guy in the pub, was part of the war effort. Audiences didn't just watch it, they lived it. The government actively pushed the message, and people walked out of theaters uneasy, suddenly second-guessing their own habits. It's a propaganda piece, sure, but it's also a masterclass in suspense, showing how words themselves could be as dangerous as bombs. The Next of Kin is the kind of film Americans often overlook because it doesn't roar with heroics, it whispers with menace. And sometimes, whispers are louder. Fires were started 1,943. Forget tanks and dogfights. Fires were started, turned the spotlight on unsung heroes battling flames in the Blitz. Directed by Humphrey Jennings, one of Britain's greatest documentarians, the film blurred the line between documentary and drama. Jennings didn't hire big stars. Instead, he used real London firefighters, men who actually faced bombs raining down while trying to save their city from burning. That authenticity crackles in every frame. The film doesn't waste time with melodrama. Instead, it shows the grinding routine. Tea breaks interrupted by sirens, exhausted men clambering onto fire engines, walls collapsing without warning. Jennings captured the terrifying beauty of fire lighting up the night sky, turning London into a flickering battlefield. Americans at the time rarely saw this side of the war. Hollywood focused on soldiers charging across Europe, while Fires Were Started revealed another reality, the war at home, fought by men with hoses and helmets instead of rifles. It's understated, it's poetic, and it's devastating. The impact went far beyond cinema. The film gave civilians, especially Londoners, a sense of dignity. Their struggles were worth telling. Their courage was worth recording. In a way, it was Britain's answer to America's Why We Fight series, only with fewer speeches and more raw humanity. Fires Were Started remains one of the greatest war films you've probably never seen, and that's the tragedy. 2,000 women, 1,944 prison camp films became a Hollywood staple after the war, but Britain got there first with 2,000 Women. Released in 1944, this one told the story of British women trapped in an internment camp in Nazi-occupied France. Instead of soldiers or spies, the focus was on ordinary women, wives, mothers, daughters, suddenly forced into survival mode. What makes it stand out is the tension between everyday life and extraordinary danger. These women form alliances, keep morale alive, and secretly plot against their captors. There's grit, humor, and resilience woven into the story, showing that war wasn't only fought with weapons, it was fought with endurance, wit, and unity. Directed by Frank Launder, better known for comedies later in his career, the film carries a surprising mix of suspense and warmth. It never collapses into gloom. Instead, it highlights the humanity of its characters, even as they endure harsh conditions. That balance makes it incredibly modern. For Americans, who often imagine World War II cinema as soldiers storming beaches, 2,000 Women is a wake-up call. It's about how ordinary citizens, half the population really, shouldered the burden of war in ways Hollywood didn't often explore at the time. This isn't a spectacle of combat, but a story of spirit. And spirit is exactly what kept Britain standing. Millions Like Us, 1943. Before Rosie the Riveter became a pop icon in America, Millions Like Us put women's factory work at the center of the screen. This 1943 film focused on the lives of women in Britain's wartime industries, especially aircraft production. Directed by Sidney Gilliat and Frank Launder, it gave a sweeping view of how war reshaped personal lives. At its heart is a romance between an ordinary worker and an RAF pilot, but the film doesn't stop at love. It captures the factory floors, the camaraderie, and the bittersweet reality of building planes that might carry loved ones into danger. Every rivet, every shift, every goodbye was part of the war effort. Millions Like Us is a blend of documentary-style grit and melodrama. It was propaganda, yes, but it was also entertainment designed to reassure people that their sacrifices mattered. Unlike glossy American wartime romances, this film showed grease-stained hands, cramped living quarters, and very real grief. What makes it unforgettable is the sense of collective identity. The title says it all. Millions of ordinary people, not generals or leaders, carried Britain through the darkest days. Americans missed this one because it didn't match their appetite for big-budget heroics. But for anyone curious about how the home front actually looked and felt, Millions Like Us is a vital, moving portrait. The bells go down 1943. If you think only the brave stories started in Hollywood, The Bells Go Down proves otherwise. Released in 1943, it chronicled the London Auxiliary Fire Service during the Blitz. These weren't seasoned professionals, they were volunteers, cabbies, clerks, and students turned firefighters overnight. The film dramatizes their struggles with a mix of grit and warmth. We see men learning on the job, cracking jokes to mask fear, and facing terrifying nights when entire city blocks lit up like hell on earth. There's camaraderie, humor, and heartbreak in equal measure. Actor Tommy Trinder brings a touch of comedy, but the core of the film is deadly serious. Ordinary people risking everything to keep London alive. Unlike American war films, which often leaned into triumph, The Bells Go Down emphasizes perseverance. Victory wasn't guaranteed. Survival itself felt miraculous. That's what makes the film resonate. It captures the resilience of everyday people who had no choice but to stand their ground. It also became a cultural touchstone in Britain. People saw themselves on screen, not as nameless extras in someone else's war story, but as heroes in their own right. For American audiences who've never watched it, The Bells Go Down is a reminder that courage isn't always about charging into battle. Sometimes it's about dragging a hose into a burning building, while bombs fall outside. Went the day well? 1942. Imagine your quiet English village suddenly crawling with disguised invaders. That's the nightmare Went the Day Well? Brought to life. Released in 1942 and directed by Alberto Cavalcanti, this film posed a terrifying what if. German troops slipping into a rural town under friendly uniforms. At first, the villagers welcome them, but suspicion builds, and when the masks come off, chaos follows. The tension is masterful. Ordinary shopkeepers, farmers, and children suddenly become frontline defenders, using whatever they can to fight back. The film doesn't shy away from shock. There are betrayals, sacrifices, and moments of sudden violence that would have stunned audiences at the time. It's not neat or patriotic in the glossy sense. It's gritty and unsettling. What makes Went the Day Well so fascinating is its blend of propaganda and genuine thriller craft. It was meant to warn audiences to stay alert, to not trust appearances, and to be ready for anything. But it ended up being more than that. It's a chilling piece of suspense cinema that still feels fresh decades later. In America, it barely registered. Maybe it felt too bleak, too rooted in Britain's unique fear of invasion. But today, critics often list it as one of the best British war films ever made. If you've never seen it, you're missing not just a classic, but a film that dared to imagine the unthinkable and make it feel terrifyingly possible. The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, 1943. Grand, colorful, and decades ahead of its time, The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp isn't just a war film, it's Britain's masterpiece. Directed by Michael Powell and Emeric Pressburger, this 1943 epic follows the life of Clive Candy, an old-school British officer whose outdated ideals collide with the brutal realities of modern war. The film is bold in ways that shocked audiences. It spans 40 years, showing Candy's transformation from dashing young officer to aging relic, wrestling with whether his chivalry still matters. The irony? While Americans were cranking out black and white action reels, Britain delivered a full Technicolor masterpiece in the middle of wartime rationing. It looked rich, it felt big, and it tackled ideas Hollywood rarely touched, like the clash between tradition and necessity. Winston Churchill himself disliked the film, reportedly fearing it would undermine morale by making Britain's military look old-fashioned. But Powell and Pressburger stuck to their vision, crafting one of the most human, bittersweet portraits of war ever put to screen. In the US, it wasn't well distributed, partly because of its length, and partly because it didn't fit the standard war movie mold. Yet today, it's celebrated as one of Britain's greatest films of any genre. Watching it now is a revelation. You realize this wasn't propaganda. It was truth wrapped in artistry, as daring as anything Hollywood would dare try. The Cockleshell Heroes 1955. Not all heroes carried rifles, some paddled canoes straight into danger. That's the wild true story behind the Cockleshell Heroes. Released in 1955, it dramatized Operation Frankton, a daring commando raid in which a handful of British Marines used collapsible canoes to sneak into a German-occupied harbor and plant explosives on enemy ships. The setup sounds almost unbelievable, but it happened. The film, directed by Jose Ferrer, captures both the absurdity and the bravery of the mission. Long paddles through icy waters, the constant risk of discovery, and the sheer physical exhaustion, it's all there. What really stands out is the mix of tension and ingenuity, showing how sometimes the most low-tech solutions can pull off the biggest shocks. For American audiences used to grand spectacles with tanks and paratroopers, this must have looked small-scale. Canoes instead of bombers, commandos instead of armies. No wonder it slipped under the radar. But that's exactly what makes it memorable. It's about daring individuals pulling off the impossible, not overwhelming firepower. The Cockleshell Heroes sits in that unique British tradition of celebrating ingenuity and endurance over spectacle. It's not polished like a Hollywood blockbuster, but it's riveting in its own grounded way. If you want a war film that proves truth is sometimes stranger than fiction, this is it. The Silent Enemy, 1958. Long before James Bond donned scuba gear, Britain was already telling underwater spy stories, and The Silent Enemy was one of the best. Released in 1958, it dramatized the exploits of Lionel Buster Crabbe, the Royal Navy diver tasked with countering enemy frogmen and their underwater mines. The film is a thrill ride, with sequences of divers creeping through murky waters, diffusing explosives by hand, and battling unseen dangers beneath the surface. For its time, the underwater cinematography was groundbreaking. Where Hollywood war films were still locked to land and sky, The Silent Enemy went below the waves, giving audiences something they hadn't seen before. It's also one of those films that aged into legend because of its subject. Crabbe himself later vanished mysteriously during a peacetime dive, fueling speculation and cementing his myth. That shadow lingers over the film, giving it an extra punch when you revisit it today. Americans largely overlooked The Silent Enemy, maybe because it didn't fit the traditional war narrative. But looking back, it's a hidden gem, part war film, part thriller, and part underwater spectacle. It showed that war stories didn't just happen in trenches or skies. Sometimes the most gripping battles took place where no one could see them at all. Mosquito Squadron, 1969. When most war films had started fading into formula, Mosquito Squadron buzzed in with sleek planes and messy emotions. Released in 1969, this British film put the spotlight on the legendary de Havilland Mosquito bombers. These twin-engine wooden aircraft were fast, versatile, and almost mythical in reputation. The film wraps them in a fictional story of an RAF pilot tasked with dangerous raids while wrestling with grief and forbidden love. The strength of Mosquito Squadron isn't its romantic subplot, which admittedly feels dated, but the way it captures the tension of precision bombing raids. Unlike the massive formations American films often celebrated, here it's about smaller crews flying low, dodging enemy defenses, and pulling off near-impossible strikes. The cinematography delivers sweeping shots of mosquitoes slicing through clouds, paired with nail-biting moments of mission risk. For American audiences, this film barely made a ripple. By the late 1960 seconds, the appetite for World War II movies was shrinking, and Vietnam had shifted the cultural mood. But for Britain, Mosquito Squadron was a nostalgic throwback, celebrating one of the war's unsung machines. Watching it now, it's part war film, part time. Capsule, showing how Britain's cinematic memory clung to its airborne triumphs even as global tastes moved on. It may not rank with the epics, but it's a smooth, prop-driven thriller that deserves to be remembered. A Matter of Life and Death, 1946. Leave it to Powell and Pressburger to make one of the boldest war films ever. A story that dared to mix romance, fantasy, and the afterlife. Released in 1946, A Matter of Life and Death, released in the U.S. as Stairway to Heaven, is technically set after the war, but its spirit is deeply rooted in wartime Britain. The film opens with a British pilot, played by David Niven, bailing out of his damaged plane without a parachute. He somehow survives, falling in love with an American radio operator who hears his final words. But when the afterlife bureaucracy realizes a mistake was made, he should have died. He's summoned to argue for his right to live. What follows is part courtroom drama, part love story, and part cosmic spectacle. Why include it on a World War II list? Because it captures Britain's post-war psyche like nothing else. The bold Technicolor Earth scenes, contrasted with the black and white afterlife, reflected both trauma and hope. It wasn't about the battlefields anymore. It was about what came after, how love, survival, and sacrifice intertwined. For Americans, it was admired but perhaps misunderstood. The blend of surreal fantasy and wartime realism wasn't the Hollywood formula, but today, critics call it one of the greatest British films ever made. It's playful, profound, and visually stunning in ways that feel ahead of its time. A Matter of Life and Death is proof that Britain didn't just make war films to rally morale. They made them to wrestle with life, death, and everything in between. Few war movies are as daring, or as unforgettable. In Which We Serve, 1942. If you want the closest thing Britain had to a national hymn on film during the war, it's In Which We Serve. Released in 1942, this naval drama was co-directed by Noel Coward and a young David Lean, making it both a star vehicle and a launching pad for one of Britain's greatest filmmakers. It tells the story of HMS Torrin, a fictional destroyer, through the eyes of its crew and their families. The brilliance of the film is its structure. It begins with the ship sinking, then rewinds into flashbacks, showing us the men who served aboard and the loved ones who waited for them back home. The effect is sweeping yet intimate. You're not just watching battles at sea, you're seeing the ripple effect on entire households. Husbands, wives, children, neighbors, all woven into the war effort. What makes it powerful is Coward's balance of patriotism and grief. He plays Captain Kinross with stiff upper lip dignity, but the real heart of the movie lies in the everyday sailors and their connections to ordinary British life. It wasn't just about fighting at sea. It was about what that fight meant for a whole community. For American audiences, In Which We Serve was respected but not worshipped. In Britain, it became iconic, practically required viewing during wartime. Watching it now, you can see why. It's heartfelt, stirring, and a cinematic rallying cry. It might be propaganda, but it's also deeply human, showing how war knits together people in ways they never imagined. Waterloo Road, 1945. Not every war film needed bombs falling to make its point. Waterloo Road proved that the emotional battles at home were just as intense. Released in 1945, right as the war was ending, the film told the story of a soldier who goes AWOL from the army to confront a man back home trying to steal his wife. This setup might sound like melodrama, but it tapped into a very real wartime anxiety. Relationships strained by long absences, temptation, and the uncertainty of survival. While America leaned toward patriotic reunion stories, Britain wasn't afraid to show the cracks, the jealousies, the fights, the desperation that war unleashed in private lives. What makes Waterloo Road fascinating is its rawness. It's not just a love triangle. It's about loyalty, fear, and the cost of sacrifice on both sides of the uniform. The backdrop of London, under siege, only amplifies the tension. Director Sidney Gilliat captured the gritty reality of a city bruised by war, with characters torn between duty and desire. For American audiences, this probably felt too small, too soap-like. But for British viewers in 1945, it was painfully real. They didn't need to see tanks rolling across Europe, they needed to see their own struggles reflected on screen. Waterloo Road may not have the glory shots of soldiers marching, but it nails the human drama that war always leaves behind. The Way Ahead, 1944. If you want the perfect capstone to Britain's World War II cinema, look no further than The Way Ahead. Directed by Carol Reed and released in 1944, this film followed a group of raw recruits, from clumsy civilians to hardened soldiers, through training and into their first taste of battle. It's a classic arc, but done with such charm and grit that it became a touchstone for how Britain saw itself during the war. The cast included a young David Niven, who embodied the stiff upper lip leader trying to mold everyday men into a fighting unit. Alongside him were working-class characters who brought humor and humanity to the barracks, showing that the war wasn't just won by officers, but by the collective effort of the nation. The Way Ahead works both as entertainment and as national morale booster. It acknowledged the hardships of training and the fear of combat, but always returned to the idea of unity. Everyone, no matter their background, had a role to play. For Americans, the film got overshadowed by their own massive productions, like 12 O'Clock High or The Story of G.I. Joe. But The Way Ahead remains one of Britain's definitive statements on the war. It's a rallying cry, a piece of art, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from individuals, but from the way ahead together. So, there you have it, 15 British World War II films that most Americans missed, each one offering something Hollywood rarely gave: grit, paranoia, humor, and unfiltered humanity. These weren't glossy victory reels. They were windows into the daily fears and triumphs of a nation under siege. The question is, why aren't we watching them now? Maybe it's time to give these forgotten classics their rightful place. Which one grabs your curiosity first? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe for more cinematic deep dives. The reel goes on.